On 13 September 2022, Mahsa Jina Amini, a 22-year-old Iranian woman of Kurdish origin, was arrested in Tehran. It was alleged that she had not properly covered her hair while she was in public. She died 3 days later while in custody, sparking demonstrations that represented one of the biggest challenges to Iran's leaders in recent years. This once again brought into the mainstream discourse the question of whether human rights are compatible with Islamic values. To explore this question, we invited Dr. Arzoo Osanloo to discuss with us her book titled The Politics of Women's Rights in Iran, published by Princeton University Press. Dr. Osanloo is a professor in the Department of Law, Societies and Justice and the director of the University of Washington's Middle East Center. She also holds adjunct appointments in the School of Law and the Departments of Anthropology, Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, Gender, Women's and Sexuality Studies, and Comparative Religion. She earned her PhD in Cultural Anthropology at Stanford University in 2002. Prior to that, she practiced law. As a former immigration and asylum refugee attorney, Professor Osanloo became concerned with the fraught but often neglected relationship between culture and rights. As a legal anthropologist, her research and teaching focus on the intersections of law, culture, and politics, including human rights and humanitarianism. In this book, she demonstrates the ability of ordinary individuals, particularly women, who are non-experts, to challenge the dominant control exerted by state actors and elites in shaping the concepts of culture and rights. However, it is important to note that her book does not focus on women's resistance. Instead, it examines how rights function within the context of the Islamic Republican state. By examining contemporary Iranian discourses on women's rights, she has explored the impact of the Iranian Revolution, particularly the role of women's rights in the anti-imperialist discourse of 1979 and the establishment of the post-revolutionary nation-state as an Islamic republic. In this conversation, Dr. Osanloo walks us through the unique dynamics within the theocratic Republic of Iran, which combines elements of both Islamic and civil laws. Her argument revolves around the idea that women's perception of rights are shaped by the complexities of the specific circumstances and incorporate multiple ideologies of rights. She has demonstrated that specific groups of women in specific positions hold particular opinions about rights, which are further shaped by the discourses of rights available in their respective contexts. She argues that these discourses encompass liberal notions of individual rights, Islamic ideals, and sometimes even pre-Islamic Iranian ideals. By dissecting the specific ways in which religion operates within the legal system, she identifies critical moments where women articulate their rights within the fluid and hybrid nature of multiple legal ideologies. Welcome to Haqq, a podcast on Islamic studies where we try to assemble perspectives around Islam through the lens of theology, anthropology, philosophy, politics, and more. Through our conversations with academics coming from various disciplines within the field of humanities and social sciences, we try to foreground Islam as a tradition of debate, dialogue, and critique, thus challenging certain settled ways of thinking about Islam and Muslim societies. Hello, Professor Osanloo. Welcome to Haqq podcast. So in this conversation today, I'll try to unpack with you how your book, The Politics of Women's Rights in Iran, has explored the way Iranian women themselves conceptualize their rights. And we'll try to see how you have foregrounded the voices of Iranian women who are otherwise presented as passive victims. But as you have shown us in this book, they are agentive beings who are constantly pushing the boundaries of their everyday existence. And so basically what I want you to do is to help us understand the multifaceted and the dynamic nature of Iranian women's struggle for what they consider to be their rights. But I'll try to begin with asking you a bit about your intellectual journey and what were the experiences that shaped your interest in Iranian women, Islam, law, and anthropology.
Okay, well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for your interest in my work and in my research. You know, I grew up in the United States. I was born in Iran, but my heritage is Iranian, but I grew up in the United States. And I always wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to help people. I thought it would be really interesting to do that on an international basis. So I really focused my legal studies on human rights, not just the civil rights that we can afford citizens in the United States, but actually beyond that. And so it was really trying to understand what human rights means in an international context, but in a world made up of nation states where people are bound to a country, a nationality, and therefore their rights are in relation and constant struggle, I would say, to that state and the broader socio-cultural issues in their society. And as first, let me say, as a law student in the early 1990s, I was really interested in let me just back up for a second and say it's like a two-pronged interest that led me to study the politics of women's rights in Iran, which is the title of the book that ultimately came out. And the first prong was sitting in my human rights class in law school and sitting around a bunch of, American people. At that time, most of them, the law students, were white Americans. And they were, very adamant, pounding their fists on the table, talking about needing to help the women over there. So it was like a sense that we in America have our women's rights, but the women over there, and over there was made up of, myriad regions of the world. But when we got to the unit on the Middle East, there was I had a very interesting experience. And this was that the white Americans in the classroom had a sense they already knew that women in Muslim societies or women in the Middle East and perhaps South Asia are oppressed. And they also kind of knew that as a foil to their own experiences of freedom. Now, myself, having, Iranian heritage, but growing up in the United States, I was completely impressed, I should say, by the sense that my colleagues in law school had of their knowledge about the world. And I was stunned that this was not something to be studied or interrogated, but rather something they already knew. And we had to help. And the word that came up a lot, we had to educate the women about their rights. And that really stunned me too. And one of the reasons it stunned me was because I knew at that time exactly 3 Iranian women: my mother, my aunt, my mother's sister, and my grandmother. And those women were not oppressed by no stretch of the imagination. So initially I became very interested to know how it is that some people already know that there's this reified oppressed Muslim woman. And the other thing that I think really interested me was, as lawyers, we have to take a professional responsibility exam. And I never knew this, but on the professional responsibility exam in the US, you must show you have a professional responsibility to your client to represent them, but not just represent them, but represent them. And so impressed with my advocate colleagues who had this sense of self-confidence in their advocacy, even though they had no knowledge about the women in the societies on which they were advocating. So the reason this was kind of puzzling to me was I asked myself the question, how do you know that the women there want your help? How do you know that even if the women there want your help, how do you know how to help them? How do you know, A, what they want, but also how do you know that your actions, which derive from your American society, will actually be beneficial to the women there? And the reason this was because I had studied a little bit about the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And one thing that was clear was that this was an anti-imperialist revolution. And one of the ways in which the leaders of that revolution were able to kind of consolidate their power was by deploying this anti-imperialist language that both leftists in Iran and secular nationalists and Muslims, Islamists, agreed upon. And that was that in the West, there's an excessive notion of individualism. And one of the ways in which societies have been harmed was the individualism in particular as it accrued to women, because this disrupted the family. Now, I'm not saying I believe in this or I agree with this. What I'm saying was this was a discourse that in the late 1970s and even a little bit earlier was picked up by revolutionaries. And the discourse of women's status became very important in Iran during the time of the revolution, okay? And these groups were using the objectified sort of image of the Western woman as a foil to the respected Iranian woman who would wear the veil, and she would have rights and she would be respected. But through this prism of kind of anti-imperialist finding of some authentic culture. And the debate was about what this authentic culture was, right? Some people were saying it's Islam. Some people were saying, no, it's not Islam. It's pre-Islamic. Still go on. However, as we see in many societies and feminists, this women's bodies became this object on which debates about the revolution, the new country that would be emerging after the fall of the Shah, it was all surrounded around improving the status of women in that society. Now, one of the ways in which the Islamists or the Muslim leaders were able to sort of consolidate their power was that they said, look, this discourse of rights is one of the big problems in the West because it forces people to be individuated and people step out of their roles, and this disrupts the foundation of society, which is the family. Nobody knows their place anymore. And a lot of people agreed with this at that time. And so the discourse of rights, whether it was women's rights or any kind of individual rights, were now being associated with the anti-imperialist movement of this Iranian revolution. Of course, not everyone thought that way. Particularly secular nationalists did not think that way. They wanted, a secular democracy, and they wanted, their image of women's status being improved was if women had equal status as citizens, so equal rights before the state. The Islamists saw it differently. They said, well, no, you cannot have rights talk or rights discourses that are separated from the cultural views of what the roles of women are in society, what the roles of men are in society. And this was a very important struggle at the early point of the revolution. And in 1979, when Khomeini arrived 2 weeks after the Shah left the country, he arrived on February 1st. Today's February 10th. In your country, it's February 11th, which is the annual day of the creation of the new country, post-revolutionary society in Iran. But one of the things that Khomeini did was he said women should be more attentive to their social roles, and the idea that women are the, source of social honor, social chastity, and therefore they should wear the headscarf. The full important cleric, Ayatollah Taleghani, stated that women in Iran should wear the black chador to show the world that Iran has changed. And by saying this, he was also making a political statement about Islam, about the revolution, and hence this is one of the early episodes of political Islam that historians and other scholars have recorded. Now, when they did this, on International Women's Day, March 8th, International Women's Day, and then several days following, women and men, mostly women, in the tens of thousands, poured into the major cities' streets of Iran, protesting this incredible sort of encroachment on their bodies and their rights. And they held up signs in Persian, but also in English, saying women's rights, equal rights. And what was telling was the women were attacked. They were attacked by those same Islamist revolutionary forces. And this was an incident that showed me, A, that the discourse of rights is now being associated with the anti-imperialist aspects of the revolution, and B, that talking about women's rights was a threat to the early leaders of the revolution who wanted to turn the country into an Islamic country. And I mean, it was already the state into an Islamic state. So going back to my friends in law school, right, when they said, we have to go to Iran, or Iran or whatever countries, and educate women about their rights. The problem wasn't that women didn't know about their rights. The problem was that some of these activists did not know the politics around the discourses of rights in Iran and other countries in the region. And I say this because during those protests in Iran in 1979, when the women poured out into the streets to protest the mandatory veiling laws, the suspension of the Family Protection Act, which had given women in Iran some rights in gaining divorce, child custody, and lose suffrage. They never did, but that was also on the table at that time. And because it was March 8th and the revolution had just taken place a few months earlier, the Shah had left, there was a pre-planning event where in the fall of that year or whenever, I don't know exactly, the sort of activists had invited an American feminist to speak at the events. Now, she still went to that event. I want to tell you her name is just like, Kate Millett. She went to that event and she gave a speech, but her presence alongside of these tens of thousands of Iranian women protesting their rights gave women's rights in Iran and activists for women's rights in Iran the pall of being in the sort of pocket or in the interest of the Westerners, the Western feminists. So all of this is to say that I think in order to really understand women's rights in any country, we need to first understand the social, cultural, legal conditions of possibility in those contexts. We need to understand that sometimes external help can actually undermine the local movements, particularly in countries like Iran that have a state that is very anti-imperialist, and it's one of the pillars of the Iranian Revolution. And third, I think we need to ask the women themselves what they want, what will help them, right? So as many people know, there is a lot of concern about mandatory veiling. But in the immediate aftermath of the revolution, that was one very, how can I say it, visual element of the change in the country, which was intentional. But if we want to think about what really affected women in Iran, you can't just sort of dwindle it down to bodily autonomy, even though that's very important. I'm not saying it's not. It's just that there were other things that were important as well. Their legal rights, but also labor rights, let's say workers' rights, rights in education, rights in marriage, rights in divorce. Of Western allies at that time had invaded Iran, and they were dealing with food rations. They were dealing with sending husbands and uncles and fathers to the front lines of the war, where each side lost something like 500,000 people. So those concerns were not delivered upon, when people had these concerns with rights. So that's to just give you a little bit of a background of what led to my interests to study this topic. And it had to do, like I said, with my interest in being a better human rights advocate. So I wanted to understand where the social, political, legal context of those societies, talk to the people there, find out what really concerns them, and how do they think about their rights.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And thank you for giving this very detailed explanation of the Islamic Revolution and the social political milieu of that time. I think that's really necessary. When these protests broke out last year after the killing of Mahsa Amini, I live in India, and here the narrative among a lot of liberal feminists was that, that Iranian women have been suffering a lot ever since the Islamic Revolution took place, and now they're saying enough is enough. They no longer want to be oppressed, and they are demanding freedom and bodily autonomy, etc. But what people were not talking about was the fact that Iranian women have always been fighting for their rights in their own ways, something that scholars like you have very convincingly shown us. So I want to take this opportunity to let you talk a bit about your ethnographic study of the Qur'anic meetings that you attended in urban Tehran. And I want you to tell us a bit about how these meetings, what do these meetings reveal about the way Iranian women explore spiritual questions and how they interpret the Quran in light of present day concerns? And what does that tell us about the way they perceive their rights within the Islamic Republic?
Oh, that's a great question. One of my favorite chapters in that book is about these scriptural reading groups, which they're called dore in Persian. I don't know if that's the same word in Hindi. I know there are a lot of shared words, but dore means circle. And this is a kind of a historical, cultural phenomena in Iran. There are dore for many things, for poetry reading, for literature, for any kind of philosophy, intellectual gatherings. And it's like a French idea of a salon, if you will. And when I was to think of this as my research, I thought, okay, I'm going to go to the courts, I'm going to talk to lawyers, I'm going to study what the intellectuals think, and also talk to women, ordinary women. Well, then one day after, I went to court and after I did what I consider to be my research, a friend of mine said, hey, we're all going to this scriptural reading group. Would you like to join us? And I said, sure, it'll be interesting, fun, whatever. It was a side event. And lo and behold, we go there, and it was truly fascinating. For one thing, this was 20 years after the revolution. So I started doing my fieldwork in Iran in 1999. And I continued every year. I go every year. I haven't gone since COVID. But, this fieldwork, though, was my PhD fieldwork. I stayed there for 12 full months, didn't leave the country. And this scriptural reading group, the person who opened it stated that they had these scriptural reading groups prior to the revolution, and they stopped because of the revolution, because of war, because of so many things going on. And they were just, that first meeting I attended, they were just recommencing holding these scriptural reading groups. And it was so interesting because this woman held her kind of very well read copy of the Quran in her hands. And she held it up and she said, we had these meetings before the revolution, but at that time, we had somebody else come and explain the Quran to us. Today, we are going to read this for ourselves and determine its meaning to us now. This has two important implications. One is that, first, let me just give a little bit of background. Prior to the revolution, it was very customary in these kinds of scriptural reading groups that a scholar of Islam, what we say, a member of the ulama, the scholarly, has done scholarly studies in Islamic jurisprudence and Islamic principles, would come and speak and sort of lecture to these groups, whether it was women, men, youth, elderly, what have you. And one of the things that they were doing that was different in this group in 1999 was they were reading it on their own without the aid of some kind of intellectual or theological expert. So that's the background. So the two things that are very interesting about this. Number one, she said, now we are going to do the cultural work ourselves. And what she was referring to are two things. The first is for Shiites, unlike Sunnis have a caliphate. They have a designated leader. Shiites have always had a different path. An individual Shiite Muslim is supposed to have an unmediated relationship with God. So what this woman was saying was, in the past, when we brought the expert, that was a mediated relationship. And we want to change that. We want to have this unmediated relationship. And we want to read the Quran on our own to figure out its terms for our present conditions. That was very bold and very interesting. And the other thing that was very interesting was that this new state, this new post-revolutionary state, was not an Islamic government. It was an Islamic republic. And it is written into their constitution that people have individual rights. So even despite what I said at the beginning of our meeting, of our interview, this raises a very interesting contradiction in terms in the Islamic Republic. Because on the one hand, you are saying that rights discourse is a product of the West and it leads to bad society because people are individuated. But on the other hand, you create a republic that has its basis in its, and they said this very explicitly, France's Cinquième République, French Fifth Republic, with its division of, branches of government. And it required things of individual citizens, of which, among them were women. And so they were saying, we have two motivations or sources through which we need to study this on our own. And one was Shiism and the Quran that requires them to have an unmediated relationship with God, but also the requirements of the new republic. So this popular uprising to remove a monarch is often forgotten when we think about the Islamic Republic. So these scriptural reading groups were interesting to me because not only were they reading the scripture and trying to think about how that would affect or apply to their everyday lives, but in each of these meetings, there were 33 hours long meetings with like lovely, food and tea and everything. They would always invite a speaker. The speaker was not, as in the past, a man who was trained in the Islamic jurisprudence, but somebody from different areas of life. All the times I attended, which was about 8 or 9 times, were women. And it was stunning to see. So one meeting I went to was right before they were having city council elections in Iran, the first city council elections and since the revolution. And they invited a woman who was running herself. Well, no, she ran for parliament later, but she was talking about who to vote for and how, they could form voting blocks to vote in the really, interesting candidates interesting to their interests. So that was really interesting. Another time they invited a very well-known family lawyer, a woman who was very pious. She was a very pious Muslim, but she came and she talked about women, she didn't talk about, women's rights in marriage, like in sort of abstract terms. She was a lawyer. She came and she talked about the pragmatics of filing a complaint in family court to get a divorce. Like how exactly are the filing fees? And so she had this very, very pragmatic advice, which was very interesting. Another time they invited a child psychologist. And this child psychologist talked about the effects on adults when, as children, that boys are treated differently from girls. And she encouraged the women to raise their children in an egalitarian household. And she said, oh, and everyone laughed. She said, oh, I've seen this where, your son comes home from school and you say, oh, my darling, you must be so tired. Let me get you a snack and some tea. Your daughter comes home and you say, run the laundry and help me with dinner. And she said, don't do that to your children, because then you're going to raise children to participate in creating an egalitarian society. So these kinds of things blew my mind, because the women were doing this in a scriptural reading group, and they were finding sources for this, both in the Quran, in their faith, and in the formation of this post-revolutionary state, the Islamic Republic.
Right. That's very interesting. Thank you. So this brings me to another side that figures very prominently in your book, and that is the family court in Tehran. So I want you to help us understand how this blend of Islamic and civil laws that exists within the family courts in Tehran, how does this blend help women litigants to emerge as autonomous liberal subjects who are bearer of rights, but at the same time it also allows them to behave like pious Muslims. So how does that, could you please explain how does that work within the court? And through that, please help us understand how Iranian women have been making use of the law to gain better rights for themselves.
Thank you so much for that question. And I really appreciate your close reading of the book, because sometimes I do these interviews and I realize the person hasn't even read my book. So this was another thing that really shocked me. But again, I realized it shocked me because I was coming at the issue in a way that was incorrect. And I have to give a little background, if that's okay. So when I started my PhD in anthropology, it was 1995. And I didn't say in our first part of this discussion that, my experiences in law school and that human rights class, etc., led me to do that kind of research of what do the women think and what do they want, sort of thing. So when I got to anthropology, and in a PhD program, you do a couple of years of coursework, and then you write your proposal, and then you do field work, and then you come back and you write your dissertation for between 1 or 2 years. Now, in those 2 years, those first 2 years when I was doing coursework, I focused on the scholarly literature on women in Iran, women in the Middle East, and discussions of family law, women's rights, and so on. And, it must be said that right after the revolution, a lot of scholarly texts that were published, I would say in the early 80s, suggested that women in Iran lost their rights. Women in Iran were being forced into the home. They could not have careers. They couldn't be outside. And often this was not a very accurate picture. It may have been threatened, but there were other conditions that prevented the state from pushing women all the way into the home. And much of that had to do with the war. Men were sent to the front lines, and women had to take up many civil society roles. And then the discourse of the revolution was about uplifting women, elevating their status. And I was just looking over, there's books of speeches that Khomeini, the first leader of the revolution and the republic, gave to women. And he was saying, you stand shoulder to shoulder with men in this society. So there was a different sensibility about women's roles in society for women in Iran. And the literature on women in Iran, I would say by the late 80s, 1990s, caught up with this. Literature that was coming out in Iran at this time was noticing that empirically women are in society, women are participating, women do have roles. And there were many challenges, but the challenges, so getting a divorce, a lot of this scholarship said women do have rights, but they're limited to sort of Islamic rights and their rights within Islam. And this was repeated often enough that by the time I went to Iran, that was, as a scholar, as a junior scholar, I was building on what, the scholarly literature that preceded me. And because I was a lawyer myself, I forgot, in the United States, I didn't do family law, but I thought, okay, one avenue for me to find interlocutors, people with whom I can do field work, was lawyers. I myself was a lawyer, could go sit in legal, offices. I got permission. They sat in on client cases, client interviews. I met with their clients. I went to court with them. I got permission to sit in family court. And what struck me was when I said, how do women, when I asked these people, how do women get their rights in Islam? All the legal, the people in the legal sphere, they said, what are you talking about? Like, we don't get our rights through Islam. We go to civil court. Iran has civil courts. The lawyer said to me, I'm a lawyer. I'm not a theologian. We have civil codes. You need to read the civil codes. You need to go to the courts. This was really puzzling to me because it was going against everything that the scholarly literature on this. So I decided, okay, it is really important for me to understand, how women are getting their rights. And the lawyers, and this was a woman who was a lawyer both before the revolution and after. So she wasn't, just presenting one point of view. When I went to court, what was most remarkable, I guess, in a way, was that it wasn't remarkable at all from the perspective of myself, a lawyer who studied law in the United States. People went to court. They quoted the civil code. They didn't quote Islam. Of course, these are principles that are, drawn from this state's interpretation of Islam. However, in order for a woman at that time to get a divorce, build a case for herself, she needed to show that, basically she needed to overcome a presumption. And the presumption that there's no basis for women to leave a marriage. So there were certain provisions in the code of marriage and family law, which gave a basis for which a woman could go and ask the judge to grant a divorce. And the technical thing that's happening here is that the woman technically has no right to dissolve a marriage herself. A man does. When you ask people in Iran why it's the case, when you ask jurisprudential scholars, they'll say, "Oh, that's because it's in the Quran." Now, these things are contested, and that's why I say it's the state that has made these interpretations. And in any case, these provisions require a woman to prove them. Now, a man, on the other hand, has no reason, does not need a reason, at least at that time, did not need a reason. What we say in legal terms is did not need to show cause. A man at that time in 1999 could just go and say, I want to dissolve this marriage. And there's some jurisprudential theory behind this, that it's the woman's family that presents the marriage contractual form. It's the husband that gets to dissolve it if he suggests that he doesn't want to remain in the marriage or the contractual basis isn't being met. And you can go even deeper into studying why that is in certain societies, even pre-Islamic societies. Women didn't have earning potential. They depended economically on some male kin. So this goes back and back and back. And Iran is not the only country that's like this. It's not even, limited to Muslim countries. Regardless, women needed to show cause, men did not. And the bases through which women needed to show cause were listed in the code of family and marriage. So lawyers would go and help the women. But by and large, women couldn't afford lawyers. So many of the women I interviewed in courts and outside of courts may have gotten, a meeting with my lawyer friends or 2 meetings, but it was very rare that they could afford to have that lawyer actually represent them through a hearing or a trial. So the women that, and again, let me just back up if I wasn't clear before. What they're doing is they're taking this right of dissolving the marriage or divorce, we could say, and asking the judge to delegate that to them so they can get a judicial divorce. So the man's right to dissolve the marriage is being delegated for cause if they show a reason and prove it. Now, this requires the women to become legal actors. They have to have some kind of consciousness about the law. They have to study the provisions. They have to think about evidence, bringing in proof. I saw women bringing in expert witnesses. I saw, family members, but also affidavits, written testimony, other forms of evidence, pictures, like leases, deeds they had signed, all kinds of things. In addition to that, women had to often speak in court. Now, this is where I saw this very interesting contradiction in terms. You have Islamic leaders saying women have to be mothers and wives first, and they have to be the sort of foundation of a healthy society by running the household, by being mothers and wives first. And yet, in order to address or redress grievances that they have, even in the family context, women are forced to consider themselves as autonomous individuals with rights before the state, because these are state courts. And they can't only see themselves as mothers or wives. So in a relational context, thinking about their status in society or the roles they must fulfill, they must, in order to go to court, think of themselves as autonomous individuals with rights. Because how could you go and ask the judge to, consider your application if you don't think you have rights? So by definition, this was a training for women. Their legal consciousness and the legal setting created the conditions through which more and more over the years, like I said, I've been going to Iran now for 20 years, women see themselves as citizens of the state endowed with rights. And part of this is the way the state is set up. The way the state has codified principles in Islamic law. And so there's a difference between Sharia, which are principles in Islam, and Qanun, which is law and codified law. And a lot of scholars have studied, even in like the US context or in European context or Latin American context, this relationship between what happens to an individual who goes to court and what happens is this legal consciousness. But it leads to something even more embedded in your consciousness, in your unconsciousness. And this is what I refer to as subjectivity. You start to have a subject position vis-a-vis the world around you of one who is autonomous, of one who is endowed with rights, not somebody who is a mere, you have a status in society vis-a-vis your relationship to others. I'm a mother, therefore I have this kind of situation or this kind of role. No, you start seeing yourself as an individual endowed with rights. So this is what I call the Islamico-civil legal system in Iran. And because this civil legal system has been Islamicized, if you will, post-revolution, the laws that came down were confirmed by the parliament, by the Guardian Council, who verifies that laws are in conformity with Islam, to be in line with Islamic principles. So now you can't call these women who are fighting for their rights in court, Western, puppets of Western imperialists, as they were called 20 years earlier. Now, these women are using the very legal system that has been established post-revolutionarily by, in a post-revolutionary era by the leaders of this revolution who created an Islamic republic. And they have sort of converged on this Islamic principles through civil legal procedures, codes, and so on, which have an effect on creating individuated subjects who are endowed with rights. And yet, just going back to the tail end of your question, how are they also pious Muslims? These women are going to court, they're wearing their headscarf, they're speaking about their rights in law, but also these rights that have been verified through Islamic principles by this very state. So this is what has happened. And it's created effectively, I want to say, righteous population of women in particular, both because of the way the law and the state that I just mentioned is set up, but also going back to the original framework of the revolution to improve women's status. So women feel like they're very important in this society. And this is what was promised to them. And they're not seeing those promises. And this is one of the challenges that this government has today. The last thing I wanted to say is vis-a-vis the men in the society. Like I said, for many years, up until I want to say 10 or 15 years ago, men did not need to state a cause to get a divorce. Now, that has been restricted. Now men do have to go to court. They do have to give a reason. And parties have to actually see a marriage counselor before they can be granted a divorce. So they've done a lot of things to constrain the men's rights to get a divorce, the unilateral right of divorce that's said to come from Islamic jurisprudence. And they've also expanded the bases through which women can state a cause for divorce. And what's more, because of this decades of women having to state a case when men haven't, women have become very savvy legal citizens with legal consciousness, deeply developed. And the men, to a lesser extent, from what I saw in court. And by the early 2000s, when I was going to divorce court, I would see a big shift where men were, crying because women were presenting all kinds of evidence and they were unprepared to even respond to this.
Right. Thank you for that.
I hope that answered the question. I know it was a long answer.
Yeah, it does perfectly. So thank you for that very comprehensive explanation of how the legal system works. And in the book, you have also described the work of some women lawyers who have been helping Iranian women in gaining more rights within the realms of marriage, divorce, child custody, and so on. So could you share with us some of your observations regarding the work that these women lawyers have been doing, and how does that impact the everyday lives of ordinary Iranian women?
Well, one thing that surprised me was that people are not afraid to go and, seek state intervention in a contract dispute, a family dispute. Even though with the family dispute, it took a while. I mean, people always said to me, let me just say this, I think it's really important. Well, you were in Tehran, you were just, you were talking to like upper class women, these wealthy people who would go to court. And this was not at all the case, because in fact, the wealthy people who I didn't study were the ones who could afford lawyers. And they were also often the ones who their cases didn't go all the way to court because their lawyers would sit in a room, as it happens in US context, and they would hammer out a settlement. So it was often precisely the women who didn't have family support or didn't have financial means who found themselves going to court. And like I said earlier, oftentimes these women also couldn't afford to hire a lawyer for a long period of time. So they would go, maybe have a consultation. When I was doing my field work, I think this is still the case, the family court there was one family court in Tehran. Now that it's been branched out, and then I think maybe it's been consolidated again. So there's been some shifts, at least in Tehran, but there was always like a room where you could go to get legal advice. So if you couldn't afford a lawyer, there was still kind of like an advisory like room where people would go and just talk to legal advisors about what to do. And I found this very interesting. I sat in on these sometimes too when I was in court. And I often saw, men and women. So I remember there was a case where a man, he wanted to get a divorce, but, Iran has kind of community property where if you get a divorce without other considerations, all the property that has been obtained since the marriage will be divided between the two parties. Now, this young man wanted to make sure his soon-to-be ex-wife wouldn't get anything, and he was seeking advice if he, put things secretively in his, family, his mother's name, would that be valid? So there are these advisors, there are these lawyers. Going back to your question now, when you said, say some more about the female lawyers, there were a few male lawyers that I also, I worked with in their offices and whatnot. But I saw there are a lot of people with legal education who were doing work, what we might call activism, beyond their, offices, right? While they would advise clients in their offices, they were often prolific writers, writing op-eds, writing in, numerous journal outlets in Iran, both newspapers, but also magazines, women's magazines. At the time, there was a women's daily newspaper. I don't know very many women's newspapers just dedicated to women's issues. The women in the scriptural reading group, the lawyers, they were doing a lot of this work. Even newspaper articles would come out with debates about, does Islam allow this? And can women have custody? And there were a lot of issues that women lawyers were on the front lines. But also, I guess I should say male lawyers as well. I'm not sure I'm answering your question very well. Is there something more you could ask me, like more precise, or is there something else you wanted me to touch on?
No, I think you've answered the questions.
Great,
All right.
thank you.
So I also wanted to ask you about these protests that happened last year after Mahsa Amini's killing. So you have mentioned in the book that while you were doing your field work, there were a lot of women who were against compulsory hijab, but at the same time, perhaps this was not the most important thing that was,
Yeah.
bothering them, or perhaps this was not something that they would risk their lives for. But
Right.
but last year we saw that perhaps that fear had somehow vanished, or it was not there during the protest. So first of all, is that true? And second of all, if that is, then do you feel that there has been some change in Iranian society from the time you did your field work to the situation that is currently prevailing right now? So were these protests that happened last year, were they only about hijab and bodily autonomy, or were there more factors involved there? So
Okay. Yes. So, this is kind of two-part question. And let me start with the second part. What were these protests? Killing, the state killing of Mahsa Jina Amini. And the Jina is very important because this is her Kurdish name, indicates her ethnicity. And it indicates that her parents were not allowed to register her as a citizen of Iran under her Kurdish name. So when she was reported to be in the ICU, having been hit and killed, ultimately, it was two female journalists, I should mention, who revealed this to the world, who took pictures, who talked with the parents, who published this. And they were also imprisoned. I'm not sure if they're out yet on bail or not. But this started out as just a shocking, being appalled at the way in which the state has sanctioned violence against people who, what they consider are trifles, right? This woman wasn't very defiant from what the images showed. Her head was covered. So initially, in fact, I don't even know if it was against headscarves. It was an outrage of a violent state beating of somebody who barely, if at all, had violated this provision, which is very selectively enforced, the provision of mandatory headscarves. So this outrage grew when, certain elements emerged, that this young woman was Kurdish, that, she probably was wearing her headscarf. And so the violence was all the more inappropriate and unlawful, in fact. As the state's response grew to be more about quelling the outrage as opposed to taking some measures against the now perpetrators who were acting as state officials on behalf of the state, then the outrage grew to people pouring into the streets, effectively challenging the state's very legitimacy on its leadership in many aspects of society, from worker rights, pension, retirement rights, the distribution of state resources, its policies, its foreign international policies, its treatment of its citizens, women as well as others, its treatment of the youth, its extremely harsh and retributive punishments for what many, might feel are small transgressions, if at all transgressions. And so all told, the challenges about the state's unwavering and increasingly hardline authoritarianism. And this is not what the people wanted. Now, you asked me about the generation. So when I went to Iran in 1999, I would call this a post-conflict society, not the conflict that we're talking about internally. Post-conflict in the sense that the Iran-Iraq war had just, had been ended, but it was like, finally, after 10 years since the war, the country was starting to get on some sort of stable footing. And people were starting to envision more contentment for themselves, for their children, for their future in Iran and beyond. And a period of reform. Some people then referred to it and still now refer to it. And it was also a period where there was a deep attention by the leader of that country, the president at that time, Khatami, and the very progressive at that time parliament, the Fifth Parliament, to the rule of law. And at that time, I would say that the society was just coming out of a war, trying to find some stability. And so they were much more subdued, much less demanding of their state, and much more open to giving the state a chance, because that the reformist president that the people elected by a huge majority, I think 76% of eligible voters or 78% of eligible voters in 2 elections, really promised changes that would be extremely material to people's lives. And it particularly had to do with transparency in law. And those reforms were cut short, cut back, or never appeared at all after another 10 years. And then they were starting to be rolled back. And not only were they starting to be rolled back, but ordinary citizens were seeing that it wasn't just their children, but now even very well-known reformist politicians were being imprisoned. Their children were being imprisoned. And so what I observe, and maybe there's more to the story than I'm able to offer, but one of the things that I observed was that in the intervening generation, since I started my field work, visibly avenues for progressive reform in the country were closed down in favor of harsher sanctioning, more severe punishments, with some minor adjustments. I don't want to say it was all only severe. Now, what we have to understand is that the generation that has grown up since I started my fieldwork in Iran are the children of those people who I interviewed, 20 some odd years ago. They're not part of a post-revolutionary society. They're not part of, let me say this in a different way. They didn't grow up through the revolution. They didn't grow up through the expectations have been diminished. So this Islamic Republic that I talked about, they're also citizens of this Islamic Republic. Now to see, when in 1999, 2000, 2001, what have you, I saw women going to court and getting their rights and what have you, they were fighting. But today, these things are taken for granted by this younger generation, and they are not satisfied with what is on offer, right? And at the same time, there's a tremendous power of the state that's very authoritarian, very closed to reforms, even what some of these young people consider very meager reforms. So there's no avenue. They're seeking different avenues to change legally through nonviolent means, and they're being attacked. They're being sent to prison. They're being kicked out of university. So there's so many harsh rulings on people who, as the young people, there are many very interesting slogans, but some of them were just, we just want to have normal lives. I have to say, a lot of other kind of scholars have attributed a lot of this to social media. They see the outside world. I don't disagree with that, but I also my research shows that since the revolution, the ouster of a monarch, a dictator, in favor of an Islamic Republic has created expectations of the citizenry for equal rights, for the state to be accountable to its citizens that do not necessarily derive from looking, outside of Iran. These are things that the Islamic Republic created expectations through, if that makes sense.
Right. So thank you. With this, we come to the end of this discussion. It was great talking about your book. I read this book, I think, around 2 to 3 years ago, and I read it again for the interview. But what made this book stick in my mind was this storytelling style that you adopted while, narrating the experiences of your interlocutors. And this is what I found particularly interesting, because I realized that while you were making these heavy academic and intellectual arguments on the one hand, your writing was appealing to the affective sensibilities of the reader. So you were, while you were engaging with these highly intellectual concepts, you were also sort of tying them together with the more emotional, the visceral, and the raw side of the people with whom you worked. So that is something that I found very beautiful in your work, and I hope our listener would also read the book for themselves and would also benefit from this conversation that we had right now. Thank you so much for answering all of my questions comprehensively.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your thoughtful questions, your comments, and also just your attention to the, shining a light on the topic of women in Iran. Thank you.